Hello, everyone. This is Sadhana Alangar, HL7's Director of Education. Welcome to HL7 FHIR DevDays and this presentation on terminology mapping and translation, ConceptMap updates, and new capabilities in FHIR R5. Our speaker today is Rob Hausam. At this time, I'm going to hand over the program to Rob. Rob, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Sadhana. And I really appreciate everybody being here, both in person and online. I don't know how many we have remotely, but this is great. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak today on this topic. And so let me, so first is just a little bit about myself. I am, as Sadhana introduced, I'm Rob Hausam. I'm an MD. I'm work primarily as a healthcare informatics consultant. I have my own consulting company at this point, and my background is as a family physician. I've done quite a fair bit of medical practice, at least in the past, and also electrical and computer engineering background. I am one of the co-chairs of the HL7 vocabulary work group and also observations work group. And I do, I co-lead projects in Snowbed on Fire, and particularly my other work that's not really particularly relevant to ConceptMap today, but is the IPS project, International Patient Summary, and work around that. So it's a little bit about me. And don't know most of you, at least by facial recognition, although maybe I've forgotten after 2 years. Some of you look like, I don't know, but this is actually the first time I've traveled in 2 years myself, but it's just kind of feels very normal and also a little bit weird at the same time, but it's good that we can be here together. Yeah. But I'm going to make some assumptions maybe about who's in the audience. Now this is in Billy's build as an advanced session on terminology, which is a topic that I think often tends to make people's eyes kind of glaze over, and is not necessarily the most exciting thing unless you're really a terminology geek, which some of us are. But anyway, it's great to see all of you here, and I'm assuming that you're here because you really are particularly interested in terminology translation and mapping, and the ConceptMap resource itself. So I'm hoping and anticipating that we'll have some good interaction, both as I go through with the material that I have prepared, and hopefully plenty of time afterwards to answer your questions. And it's a little hard for me to necessarily anticipate what everybody wants to know. And I will say that probably the prepared material is a little on the light side, which may be good because we'll have more time for interaction. But it's also maybe good. This is pretty late breaking stuff because the last updates to the build to get all this in, it's always a scramble, it seems, but the last ones went in this morning and got into the CI build. So you wouldn't have been able to see some of the stuff anytime really before now. You're the first ones to really have a chance to get a look at it. So that could be either good or bad. But so just a little bit about what I thought of maybe as the learning objectives for this, hopefully to understand some basic needs and uses of terminology mapping and translation. I assume, again, most of you probably already know that or you wouldn't be here. Be aware of the FHIR terminology mapping and translation capabilities that are instantiated in FHIR in the ConceptMap resource and the translate operation. And to understand the rationale and be prepared for the upcoming changes that are going to happen in this space in R5 to both ConceptMap and translate. And that's probably what we'll spend the bulk of the time on, I think. So a little bit of probably a little more background and maybe a little more basic material before we get into some of the other stuff. But so the question would be, why do this in the first place? Why do we need to do terminology mapping and translation? And these are a couple of things that I think are kind of primary and I put down, but I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts too. And like I said before, I'd like to have a lot of interaction, so I'd be happy to have interaction during the slides. So I'd love to hear some of your ideas on this. But basically, I think the reason we do this is to transform, be able to transform locally coded and otherwise maybe non-standard data. Of course, non-standard might be a bit in the eye of the beholder, depending on whose standards you're thinking about. But non-standard data, and mapping that to standard codes that can be understood and used for a variety of downstream purposes. And some of those would be obviously potentially direct clinical care, certainly clinical decision support for clinical care, but also maybe more analytic kinds of things, quality assurance, which obviously hopefully feeds directly back into the clinical care scenario, but more fundamental research potentially as well. So those are some of the things. And then another main area I think would be transforming data between the various standards that are out there, and also versions even of the same standard. So I listed CDA to FHIR and V2 to FHIR and HL7, and there's others. There's OpenAir, which EHR, which I didn't list, but there's also ISO's got the ConceptMap standard 13940, and there's work being done right now mapping that to FHIR, and there's also the reverse side of those things as well. And of course, and I didn't mention specifically, but there would be things like for billing and reimbursement, you may want to take SNOMED codes, something like that, and map them either to or from ICD 10 or ICD 11 now coming up soon, at least in many places. But also the interversion mapping is quite important, and being able to take FHIR resources from say STU3 implementations and be able to map those to R4 or to R5 coming up, and various things like that, because there's some code systems and value sets that have changed as we move things along, particularly in the non-normative space. You would expect to have that, and so being able to take data from the one version and translate to the other can be really important. And that's actually probably the biggest use of ConceptMap right now is in the FHIR build itself. It's really, I'll say a little more about this as we go on, but it's baked really into the internal infrastructure of the build, and that's posed some interesting challenges. But Graham uses this all over the place for doing stuff internally. We just don't see it necessarily exposed all the time. But there may be other reasons. So I'm curious if folks have other things to suggest that I didn't think of mentioning or including. Any thoughts? All right, we'll move on here. So the way we do terminology mapping and translation in FHIR, like I already said, is pretty much centered around two things, which are the ConceptMap resource and also the associated translate operation, which is part of that. So ConceptMap declares itself to be, it says it's a statement of relationships from one set of concepts to one or more other concepts, either concepts in code systems or potentially things that might go beyond what we tend, at least in the terminology circles, to think of as, as sort of proper terminology. But, the notion ConceptMap was always at the outset set made to be a bit broader than that, and potentially including things like data elements and, and in their concepts or classes in models. And there's various other things that people have thought to use these for, like maybe a set of medication resources actually mapped to a medication terminology, things like that. The intent is to make ConceptMap broad enough to be able to handle those kind of things. But and then the translate operation is about translating a code from one value set to another, based on the existing value set in ConceptMap resources and or other knowledge that the server, the FHIR terminology server has available. That's the R4B explanation of it. I also put the one that we have right now, in FHIR R5 CI build, because it's slightly changed. And this is sort of a prelude to some of the other changes I'll be talking about here. But So in R5, we've updated that language a bit to say translate a code from one value set to another based on the specified ConceptMap resource. So we didn't really say that before, and now we're trying to make that a little bit more clear that one way or another, you have to say what ConceptMap resource is being applied here. Sometimes that could be a server decision, but often it's going to be an explicit decision. You know what it is that you want to have done, and you can tell the server that. But if no ConceptMap resource is specified, then that other knowledge can come to play. So the server can do that. But we assume that's probably not, like I was saying, not really probably the default case. Normally, we wanted to make that a little clearer to people. So again, if you have any questions or comments at any point, feel free to speak up and, either here in the room or online.
There are a couple of questions here.
Okay.
Do you want to take it?
I think we can, probably.
Have you found V2 to FHIR mapping useful? There are free tools to do this, but I found it not helpful at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to say my own personal experience with it is more on the development side of it rather than the actual use and implementation side of it. So I don't know for sure how useful people are finding the efforts so far in V2 to FHIR mapping. But when there's a lot of work being done on it, there's some regular weekly calls that are done, orders and observations group and all that. But I think still kind of remains to be seen what's the real answer to that question. So love to hear more feedback on that from people.
Next question. I thought $translate is new for R5 per comments in another session, but you're talking about it as if it exists now. Can you clarify?
It does exist now. Yeah, I can clarify that. It's been there ever since, it's in STU3. It's been there. So, but then again, there's changes to it, but it's already been in the specification. Because basically, I mean, it's the way to operationalize the use of the ConceptMap. You can, well and fine to have a resource that has all this mapping in it, but it's not much more useful, than just a table or a spreadsheet, if you can't really actualize it computationally. So that's what Translate will let you do, at least in FHIR. So. All right. So I thought I would show, just a little delay there. Thought I would show just a simple example. This is one that I've used quite a bit. It's probably getting a little tired, but in some of the FHIR terminology teaching that I've done in the past. But it's just looking at a very simple map from the FHIR address use code system and value sets to the V3 address use value sets. So I've picked on a server that's actually in New Zealand. It's Peter Jordan's server, term ends, but it could have used other servers, but it's one that I do use at times. But the idea, so I'll show you just an example, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the highlights that I've got on here. But I'll just click on that and see if that all comes up properly.
Rob, sorry for interrupting. Could you come closer to the mic? Apparently you're fading in and out.
Oh, sorry. Apologies. Give me a little ringing there, but okay. Anyway, so if we basically for a particular concept map, and I'll flip back real quick. This one basically has the source being, so we get to the right, the FHIR address use value set, and then the target. This is again a value set. It's the V3 address use. That's also referenceable in FHIR and in terminology at HL7.org. So basically, we're searching to see if the term server has that concept map, and it does, and it's here, and it's quite a lot of detail. I tried to make it big enough. Maybe a few of you can see it, but I don't know how much. But I'll scroll down here to the main part, where we basically got the group. We'll talk more about some of that, but then the details there. So that's a little hard to see and read. And you can, of course, click on the link at your leisure later if you want. But so I put together another slide, and again, I don't know how readable this is, but it basically points out a couple of things. Let's get my mouse pointer in the right place. So in yellow highlights there, I've got basically the source elements. So the, again, the FHIR address use value set, and then we've got I wanted to point out that there's another set of source and target elements. And this is one of the things we'll see that's changed because we're making the names clearer so that we can be more readily differentiated. But this source and target at the group level is referencing a code system, not a value set. So there is definitely a distinction there. And then the source code is here, which is the code for home. And that's the one from the FHIR value set, and then the one from the V3 value set. Slow pointer there, but anyway, you can see it here. But it's the one, the H code from that value set. I see a question.
Yeah, quick question. I know translate document is specifically meant to go from one code system to another. Would it be possible to use the same functionality to retrieve from the same code system? So my source and my target are both LOINC, and I want to pull up all the diastolic blood pressures there, for example.
That's a great question. So I think you may have heard the question online, but basically, the idea is, can you, we talk a lot about, translating codes from one code system to another, but can you do it from within the same code system? And the answer is yes, you can. And in fact, it's some pretty important uses for that. I mean, you kind of described one, I think, but certainly, there's plenty of uses where, particularly in a rich code system, kind of mentioned SNOMED CT before, but it's probably the poster child for, having a rich hierarchy. And, for some purposes, you may need high level concepts, and others you may need very detailed concepts, and you could create a concept map to help you, move back and forth between those if you needed to.
Sorry if this is a very basic question because this is all kind of new to me, but like what happens if, like on your example here, you have like home translating to H, and you have like, below it's like work translating to, I guess it says WP, but what happens if like one of those fails, but like there are other translations available? Like, what does that look like? Does the whole thing error out, or is there like, does it show that one of them's missing?
That's a good question too, about what happens sort of if you hit a failure point. So maybe the code that that you're looking at is not a member of the value set from your source, or I'm sorry, it is a member of the source value set, but then you check. Quite a bit of ringing there, but anyway, but then you check, the concept map, and there's nothing for that, So yeah, what happens? So it depends on how you construct, the concept map. But we anticipated this would be a need, and so there is an element and a set of sub-elements for unmapped, which basically gives you default behavior that can be applied in the case where there isn't an explicit map. And that's been subject to some of the recent updates that in fact just got done, in the last day or two. So, but it's been there for a while, but it's improved. And so hopefully we'll talk about the details of some of that improvement a little bit. But yeah, that is there because that's a clear situation that occurs.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm gonna move to the next slide here. And so now we're going to actually take that concept map that we were just looking at and do translate on it to actually see what happens. So again, we'll be using the same server, and we've got, again, the yellow highlighted is all of the source data. In this case, we have additional data where we're specifying that particular code that we're going to try to translate. That's the code home in the FHIR address use value set that we want to translate and find out what its equivalent, or what its related, what its mapped, concept, if there is one specified, like we just said, what it would be in the V3 code system. So click the link and we get a shorter bit of information, which again, you probably can't see real well, but basically it doesn't repeat the information that was already there, but it gives you, the the output. And let me see with the next slide if I can drill into that a little bit better. Basically, kind of calls out a few important places here where essentially it doesn't tell you what code you put in because you already know that in the operation, so you shouldn't need to have it repeated. But the output down here talks about this is the match. So this is what you're looking for. If you get a match, in the operation, then you'll get get that output, and you see. Stop doing that. You see that it's an equivalent match, and that's probably the most common, and maybe the one most of the time you want. But you may not always want it to be that, or it may not always be. Sometimes it can be broader or narrower and things like that. But you see that, and then you see the actual code that matched in the target code system. So so that's basically a totally simple example of how what happens and how this works. Any further questions or anything before we move on a little bit more towards the changes that we're going to be seeing? Okay, so I kind of posed the question here. We've got got the ConceptMap resource, we've got the translate operation, and they do work. They are in terminology servers, have been for a good while now, like I said, at least since STU3. Can't remember if we had anything like that before that or not. I don't think so, but it's too distant memory now. But at least since STU3, and they're definitely in R4, and they're starting to get used there. And so if they're, if we have them and they're working, why change them in R5? What's the reason for that? And I listed a few things here just briefly, and we'll go into some of them in a little more detail. I mean, again, I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions that you have about this. But so one of those is that there's, in the relationships that we had available for the mappings, which we called equivalence, there was the equivalence element. There was too many, and they were too confusing, in some cases, to figure out how to use them, well. And so probably most people just default to the simple equivalent for most cases, and so then that's not so hard. But if you're trying to get more, more sophisticated than that, more nuanced, it could rapidly get into the weeds and be a little bit hard to figure out what is the right thing to do. So there was that. That's probably the biggest thing, actually. But then there was limitations that we had with the capabilities for doing dependsOn, and dependsOn is, this mapping depends on some additional information. You may not, something beyond just the code itself that you're trying to translate. You may have to give additional contextual information in order to narrow down the choice, because you may have multiple choices. And a great example where that, I've seen that come into play clearly is if you're trying to map, map a SNOMED code or something like that to ICD-10 CM, particularly the CM version, which is the US version. There's sometimes many choices available, and they have to do with things like, is this the first encounter or the second encounter, or this and that, and that's not information that's contained in it's a simple code translation. So if you really want to get down to the actual right translation, you have to give it more information. So you could set that up in your ConceptMap with dependsOn in order to be able to handle that. But we had limitations with that, the way we had done it before. It was fairly simplistic. So we wanted to improve on that. And then there's been a request from some of the heavier users of translation and terminology services, particularly the folks in Australia, Michael Lawley and the CSI group. They particularly requested some capabilities to be able to not only just map and translate from code to code, but to be able to do that either to or from value set as well. And first, it seems like, well, why would you do that? But there are some cases where you might have a single code that maps to a whole set of codes in another terminology because of just the vast differences in the granularities and things like that. So we were adding capability for that. And a couple of others that I listed here are, just the handling in general, the unmapped codes. We already had a question about that, and we needed to, there's some things that were missing there really to be able to make that full use of that. So we're trying to address that. And then some of the parameter names were either too simple or kind of too overlapping or too confusing, and trying to, just to clarify all that. So those are some of the main reasons why we wanted to make some changes in R5. And so now the way we have it at the moment, just so everybody is clear, we have actually 3 different, what I would call versions of ConceptMap that exist out there. And the first one is the sort of what I'm calling the original one, which is the one that really was in STU3 and R4 and still in R4B, pretty much unchanged. That's the currently used one. That's still available. Like I said, currently our primary default, published release now is R4B, and that's there. But in R5, as we've got actually 2 new versions, because we have the updated version of ConceptMap itself in the R5 CI build. And we started working on that and made some of the changes that we had anticipated, but found that we weren't really able to go all the way and get them all done, there, because again, the fact that it's built so deeply into the build infrastructure and all that it's very, it's very onerous to change all of that. And we kind of wanted to only do it once when we were pretty sure we had it ready to go. So we've kind of, for any further changes beyond those initial ones, like we did have, particularly we were able to change the relationship type, from the previous equivalence element to to now what we just call a relationship element, the group.element.target.relationship. And that, we got that changed in, so that's in the CI build version of ConceptMap itself. But for the additional changes, it was better to create a separate, completely new resource, ConceptMap 2, which then isn't tied to that build infrastructure, and it can be much more freely updated and all that. So the most recent stuff is all in ConceptMap 2. And we had to do that because ConceptMap is really the last remaining of what we call, would call the conformance resources. We've got, structure definition and code system and value set and all that. Those are other conformance resources. ConceptMap is still sitting out there, and it's, actually its maturity level actually got dropped when we moved to R5. It's a question in some people's mind about whether that should have gone down, but at least it didn't go up anyway. And, it's definitely not normative yet. And we're just making these changes that we're describing here. So it's not ready to go normative, but we wanted to be able to move it ahead. So we do this in ConceptMap 2. So that's where it is now. So we have these 3 kind of versions out there, but ultimately we want to end up and plan to end up with only one new one. And of course, we'll still have the R4 version around for as long as R4 is widely used, which is probably quite a long time, I expect. But in R5, we will end up with just one concept map. And so once we've deemed the changes complete, we're going to take the current concept map 2 and we'll replace the existing incomplete concept map resource with that, and that'll be the single R5 concept map going forward. So that move to the single concept map is expected to happen for this upcoming build in September, and I'm hoping, I think we hope for sure that we'll be able to do some testing of it, at least when we get to the Connectathon in September. But it's dependent quite a bit on Graham Grieve and his ability to get some of these changes in, because again, it's so interwoven into the build infrastructure that really, we need his help or his effort to get that done. So we'll get everything queued up, and then we'll basically turn to him, and hopefully he'll have some time over the next weeks and couple of months or so, at least, to be able to get that in and be able to see that showing up as the new R5 concept map. And we also need to think about library support for this, for practical use and app implementation. So we right now the current libraries, the Happy and .NET library and all that, are supporting the original version as I described it. So, but hopefully we'll get the once we get the changes ready to go, we can hopefully get some fairly rapid uptake and support for the new version as well. So that's kind of where we are with that right now and where we want to go with it. So there's some things you can do to track this if you're really interested in it. We've got a ConceptMap dashboard that we use in the vocabulary work group about this. We've got weekly FHIR tracker calls where we go over all of our outstanding change requests, and our biggest set has been the ConceptMap ones. Or again, they're maybe not necessarily the biggest in number per se, but certainly the biggest in importance and effort required to get them done. So we're tracking there with a particular dashboard. If you want access to that, I don't think you can necessarily get it unless you've been given permission or something, but you're happy to have that if you'd like to have it. So we have that, and we're working through all those issues. And so now what I was thinking I would do is just kind of go through a summary of the primary changes and some of the maybe a little bit less primary ones that you should be able to expect. And we can, as we go through this, we can, I'm happy to show them. I'm happy, and or we can kind of save that to the end and work through your questions, but we can look at them, again, what's the latest actually in the build. As I said, some of the changes have really just happened in the last 24 to 48 hours. But I'm happy to point those out. But so the one I mentioned before is about the element equivalence in the original version and now replaced by relationship. And we previously had 10 equivalence codes, which weren't all about being equivalent. That was one of the issues. That was a little bit misleading, potentially. Certainly, you wouldn't say that unmatched is an equivalent, or disjoint is definitely not equivalent. I guess in the negative sense, you could still, it's the no equivalence kind of the negation of equivalence there, but there were 10 codes, and people had trouble sometimes figuring out which ones to use. Do you go with equal, or do you go with wider or subsumes? Which is the right one? Well, good question. I mean, if your code system declares that it's based on subsumption, then subsumes probably makes sense, and it's a more specialized type of wider, and so theoretically that should work, but people still had a lot of confusion about that. And the same would be true on the narrower and specializes. And so, and also equal and equivalent, what's the difference? How would you know which one it was? There were some reasons and explanations as to why, what the more specialized versions of those would be, but in practice, we were finding implementers typically could either utilize or even understand the distinction, really. So we felt it'd be better to make that simpler. And so we basically tried to end up with a smaller set of mutually exclusive concepts that, that would just be more easy for everybody to use. So we did that, and then that was again the first big change that was made for R5. So just thinking maybe we could get out the wrong window here.
Do you want to take a couple of questions?
Yeah, if there's some questions, this would be a good time to take some.
I might have missed the big picture, but where in a business process is this used? Is it a bulk migration use case or system to system interaction use case?
Not sure if maybe you can say that question again. I'm not sure if I really got it.
I might have missed the big picture, but where in a business process is this used? Is it a bulk migration use case or system to system interaction use case?
Okay. I think I understand the question now. I guess my answer is yes. I mean, it's both. I mean, I think it has applications in bulk kind of processing of data and also individual runtime applications. I mean, it's intended to be able to cover both. There's no limitation there. So, I think it's basically any time where you have coded data, structured coded data in one coding system, and you need to migrate it to something else for whatever the reasons might be.
Does $translate track what version of a concept map was used in the output?
Yeah, that's a good question about versioning. Versioning is a very important and interesting topic, and kind of across the board, and it is here as well. And so basically, I think the answer, my take on the answer anyway, is it does track it if and when you need to, but it doesn't force you to track it. It gives you some freedom to do that. But if you don't track versioning when when you have a need for that, then you're gonna have problems, obviously. And so we pretty much have everything that we can specify. Pretty much should be able to specify a version. If it's a canonical URL using the canonical data type, that intrinsically allows you to specify a version. And many of the parameters have specific version elements for that. So we try to support the ability to do that. But excessive use of versioning is also a problem, because you end up then having a much bigger maintenance burden. I mean, if you might want to allow things to migrate naturally and kind of keep up, and if you lock everything down to a specific version, you're going to have trouble with that. So you got to kind of figure out what the sweet spot is for whatever it is you're trying to do. That's my take on that.
Is structure map changing for R5?
That's, I don't really know the full answer to that. Maybe someone else out in the audience here or remotely knows more about it. But I've been focusing enough on ConceptMap that I haven't really done all that much lately with StructureMap. But I'm not aware that there's any significant changes happening there. Certainly, we're not targeting it for use primarily in the terminology space. But so I just haven't. I haven't come across people talking about changing it much, but there could be some things that I'm not fully up to speed on. Okay.
Hey, I was going to ask a question about the relationship changes. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I work on a standard called SSSOM, Simple Standard for Sharing Ontology Mappings. And so I'm sort of mapping system to ConceptMap. And I noticed that R5 was a lot easier to map to. It's much simpler. And I was just wondering if these relationship types were inspired by SCOS, Simple Knowledge Organization System. And I was hoping we could maybe just add a small bit about that in the docs. I could file a JIRA ticket about that. But
okay.
Yeah.
That's a really great question. And I honestly hadn't even thought to mention that. But when we looked at the simplification of the relationship code system and value set, I was an advocate for actually this maybe adopting SCOS, because I've used it before in ontology work and all that. And I floated that idea. We ended up not doing that, but I think our intention though was, even though we didn't go with SCOS directly, to hopefully be alignable or pretty well aligned with it, and certainly inspired by it in the changes that we made. So that was, anyway, that was a great thought. So
are there any well-known tools to generate concept maps? And the second part question is, are there any places where you can get existing concept maps and find them for use in your projects?
Yeah, tools for generating them. There probably are some, but I think they're pretty ad hoc, and I'm not aware of mainstream tools that do a lot of this. Like, if you could imagine, say, feeding a spreadsheet, mapping rows into you know, and doing an operation on the Happy server or something, and it's spitting out concept maps, you know, for that. I don't know that we have that actually. I think it's something that will, as the use of concept map in translation becomes more and more mainstream, I'm sure we'll see, you know, capabilities of that. I mean, again, you know, I might have missed something, but I'm not aware that people have baked in that level yet, support for this. It's like, you know, Happy has, again, I'm just kind of picking on that because I use it, but there's, you know, all the other examples are similar, I think, but, you know, they have built in, you know, tooling to upload terminologies into the server and all that, but concept maps, not so far to my knowledge. But again, I expect hopefully that will be coming, because I think people certainly need it. So that was the first part of the question. Now I think I may have lost the second one. Yeah, okay, so yeah, where do you find these things? Yeah, right now it's pretty ad hoc, I think. I mean, you know, if you know you need one, you kind of you create it, and we don't have a real good central registry for this. I mean, we're doing terminology at HL7.org, you know, THO for code systems and value sets and all of that. And we have a place, as I'm recalling, I'm pretty sure we do, for concept maps, but I don't think there's anything there really. At least there's not very much. It's just, we're a little bit too early in the curve, you know, to see much of that. But again, that's going to be coming. All right. Well, let's see. I think I was going to show, you know, it's probably easier to see here, but that's we already had the question about the difference in the codes. And I'll just say a couple more things about these codes. Some of the names will look really verbose, particularly for typical FHIR you know, concepts, where you have something that's very wordy. Source is narrower than target code. And that's basically replacing, interestingly enough, it sounds opposite, but it's replacing the wider code in the previous version. And that sounds really weird, but the reason is that and I probably should have put this in a slide, but the notion about how we looked at mapping originally was we would say, I've got a source concept and I want to map it to a target. So I'm going to, you know, the mapping is going to be this target X is, you know, is mapped, you know, there's a mapping from this source. Yeah, this target X is mapped to the source code. You know, I mean, basically you look at, I'm trying to find the target, so the mapping, you know, is kind of described that way. And for a lot of things, that's a fairly natural, you know, way to do it. And I probably didn't, you know, say it very well, but that was how it was specified, and that's how it is in R4. You know, it's basically, you know, focusing on the target and then its relationship to the source. But, you know, typical relationships like in code systems, like in SNOMED and others, always go source to target. And so we had extensive discussion on this, and in the end, you know, the simpler way is to make it always source to target, and not to, and have, you know, we had problems with the names. You know, if you just say source or target in a, you know, as an attribute, basically, you know, you still might miss which way the relationship goes. And so decided it's better just to be completely explicit at the code level and say exactly what it is, that the source is narrower than the target. And so that, and, you know, so that's why, you know, that's what the equivalence is going to be between those two. We don't use the wider, narrower nearly as much as we do the equivalent mapping. So many of the concept map examples that are out there still be valid, even though we've changed a number of the codes. We've gotten rid of some of the codes, and we've you know, we've even changed the code system, but the code value actually in an instance will still be the same potentially if it's equivalent. You know, so a lot of mappings will still translate very easily that way. But, you know, the directional relationships now, you know, are just made explicit, so that to hopefully avoid any confusion about it. So that was a big change. And we talked a little bit already about the unmatched and sort of what's the default case if you don't have a mapping. You know, it's related to unmapped, and that was another, you know, it's hard to even distinguish between the two, but there was in the old version, it was necessary to create a target element in order to say that there is no target, which seems pretty kind of backwards. You know, we thought that was probably not a good idea. So replace that need to go ahead and create that target element when you don't have one with basically an element on the source that says there is no map. We're not specifying a map for this particular source concept. So that should be a simpler way to do it. All right, let's see where else. Okay, so got just a few more slides here, not too many. Some more concept map changes. We can now, as I mentioned earlier, we can do the mappings now either from or to a value set rather than only on a code basis. And that can open up quite a bit of power in some cases. Can make the concept maps themselves simpler and much less verbose. So rather than having to repeat a row for everything in a large value set that you wanted to map, if you needed to do that, the map itself can be simpler. Yeah, and so we've added that. And our dependsOn and our product. Let me show where those are, because that might not be super obvious, but hope that's big enough. Make it a little bigger. When we look at, we've got group, and that's kind of where things start, element, target, and then we've got the dependsOn. So this is, the mapping would depend on a particular property, or the mapping can produce, rather than just a code on the output side, and again, this is exposed in translate, can produce a product. And so let's see so basically, but what we had for both of those, we had the value is only a string, so anything you had, whether you had a code or anything else, was just going to be put into a string, and that's not exactly super computable and friendly. So in the new version, we've solved that, and I want to show it. And I got to move this out of the way. Let's see. So see a similar thing here. Let me go back to the resource. Okay, so now if we go down to that same area, and I went too far. So we've got, again, we've got the group oriented, keep oriented here, group, element, target, and now we've got dependsOn again. So dependsOn now has, a property URI and then a polymorphic value element with a choice of multiple data types. And I'm going to ask a question here for folks, and I guess I'm probably getting pretty close to time here. Oh, I guess we are past. Okay, well, all right. Maybe kind of a final closing question here. Does anybody see anything, if you can see well enough with these types here, is there any, do you see any issues with this set? The reason I'm asking is I came up with one when I was kind of working through it in these last couple of days, but we've got, we can specify a code or coding or any of these other data types, but anything jump out at anybody? Just curious. So I'll tell you what I was thinking when I looked at this. If we basically say that the value of a dependsOn a property is a coding, then we can say it comes from this code system and it has this particular code value. But if I was to say that the value is a code, I could put the code there, but I couldn't tell you what code system it was from because there's no binding. The binding could tell you that if it was required binding, but there is no binding at all. And so I'd just have a lone code out there when I wouldn't have any reference point for it. So I think we're gonna have to work on that, but it's just something I just realized. Well, you'd have to assume that the code's a unique value across the globe, and that's not, we don't consider that to be the case. So I mean, yeah, we have to namespace it somehow, All right, and I do think, so I guess we're over time, but I did have a couple more slide that talked about some of the translate changes and then, where we wanted to go in next steps. And I've already talked about most of that, I think, but we want to get this in and be able to test it soon. And I think that should be, anyway, I'm looking forward to hopefully getting feedback and implementation use of this, and love to hear, we can talk offline about any other questions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rob. And thanks for your questions. Thanks for participating today. Enjoy the rest of the Dev Days. Bye, everyone.